Okay, we are live here on the Frugal Crafter YouTube channel. I'm just gonna switch my screen here and we will begin on our mixed media piece. We are going to be doing watercolors and pastels. So you can use whatever brands you want, but I do have a supply list in the video description as well as on my blog. If you want the pattern so that you can just transfer it, you can go ahead and do that. This is the reference photo we're using, and I also have that on my blog if you want to grab it, or link to it in the video description if you want to download it and have it printed out and ready to go as you're working. And we're just gonna jump right into the painting. There's a couple days left to save on my watercolor courses at Teachable. The sale is over on January 1st, so that information is in the video description as well. I've got Sarah here with me.
Hello!
And there may be various noises through today's show. We've got Chewy, and we've also got
my niece.
Your niece Eleanor is here. So, yeah. So they're making gingerbread houses with my kids right now. So, well, not Chewy. Chewy's in here. She wouldn't be very helpful, I don't think, to the gingerbread house.
Mostly just eat whatever she could.
Probably. We're going to start by wetting the paper. If you have any questions as we're going along, you can ask it live in chat if you're watching on YouTube. And either the moderators will answer your question, or Sarah will relay it to me if it's something that the moderators do not know or haven't heard asked before. And I just sketch this on with just a regular old mechanical pencil. These are actually some new ones I picked up. They're Bic Velocities. They're really soft, smudgy leads that I like, but they do smudge a little bit with water, so just kind of keep that in mind. Sometimes pencils do that, and it's not really that big of a deal here. We're going to have a neutral background, so use whatever you have. I sketched mine a little high. This flower got a little out of control. I should have moved everything down a little bit, but it'll be fine. Right, and you can wet right to the edge of your paper, or you can wet in a little bit and leave kind of like if you want to have kind of a rough outline on the outside of your picture. It's completely up to you. So we're going to start off with some yellow ochre. I'm going to bring it onto my palette here. Either yellow ochre or raw sienna. You just want an earthy yellow. And to that we are going to get another puddle. We won't mix them quite yet. I'm using umber. You can use burnt umber. These are the Yarka watercolors, so some of their names are a little bit different. But this is PBR6, which is a brown that I'm not very familiar with. I usually use a PBR7, so I thought that might be kind of fun. It's almost like a cooler brown. It's more like a sepia than like a burnt umber. That's what the color tone looks like. I'm going to grab a little ultramarine blue as well. And we'll be able to make some really nice neutrals with these. So I'm going to start off with some of the umber and ultramarine, get kind of a nice dark brown, and bring it in down here towards the bottom of the background a little bit. I'm going to go right over the bottles, but I might go in and blot a little bit, especially on the flowers. If I feel like, especially this big kind of light pink flower, I don't want to have that too dark. Take a little bit more of that dark color over here. I'm just going to pull my pink right over out to the edge instead of having a rough border. And I'm just kind of dragging some of my extra paint around. I grab some of the yellow ochre, maybe a little bit of umber with that yellow ochre. Don't worry about the bottles because they're transparent. This background is fairly light. And plus we're going to be using pastels, so those little white flowers, we can put them on later.
Auntie Sarah.
Yes?
I finished the whole thing.
Already?
Oh wow, we have one gingerbread house completed in the other room if you're following along.
Good job, Elle.
I'm going to take a little bit of this red. It's kind of like a cool red, but I'm just using it with the ochre just to warm it up a little bit. A little bit of the umber too. So I'm kind of almost getting myself a little bit of a burnt sienna look with these colors. I'm adding some of that to the bottom, the table area. Went to take my son to track practice this morning and it was 17 below.
When I got up, it was 14 below. I was not pleased.
It was. I was afraid that because I took Jason's truck and then I was afraid because he went off to work and I'm like, oh no, what if my van doesn't start?
Well, John had to, because he needed some new batteries for his truck anyway, but because of the cold weather, he had to go get new batteries yesterday because it's the second time when it was cold it wouldn't start.
Oh wow.
And of course, for his truck, he needs 2 batteries.
Oh boy. And I'm sure they're so affordable.
Well, bad. I
That's
mean, you know, a couple $100, but it tax right off because it's for his business truck.
That's true, yeah. So that's good. I'm adding a little bit of blue in here. I did get a little too orange, so I just wanted to darken that up a little bit. Now, the thing you want to keep in mind is that this is going to lighten a little bit as it dries. So I'm just going to show you here. For our white flowers to stand out, we do need a little bit of darkness back there, and I'm thinking I want it a little bit darker. What I'm going to do is actually flick on some darker color. So I'm going to go with the ultramarine blue in my umber here, and just flick right into that wet background. And that will give us some nice texture as well. Hopefully I won't hit the camera with that. Dab some of that in there as well. I could go with a bigger brush though. Somebody said in the comments that your typing sounded like Chewy's claws.
Yes, that last week
around.
someone asked, like, Chewy seems, I was like, no, actually, it's just the keyboard. Christina Martin, how do Yarka watercolors compare to the more familiar brands?
Well, you know, they're very bright. Yarka and I think it's Leningrad and White Knights are all the same paint. They're all made by the same company. They're just distributed with different trade names to different parts of the world. So they have different names to kind of help market them to different consumer bases. They're really vibrant. I really like them, and these are the ones that look like this. There is also a student grade Yarka that's that you might see in like local art shops that are like in larger pans, and those are different. But all the ones that have like the rectangular pans like that are removed from the trays, they're all very vivid, and the pigments are artist grade, and they're very affordable, that's the biggest difference between them and other artist grade paints, is that they are, for what you get, they are a bargain. Like this set, a set the size I think is about $48 on Amazon, and if you got 24 full pans of pretty much any other artist watercolor, you'd be looking at a couple $100. So 24 pans, so it's a really good bargain. And I find the colors to be very bright and transparent. Some people say they think that the Yarkas aren't quite as transparent, but I haven't had that result at all. They remind me a lot of the Schminke watercolors if you've used those. But yeah, I'm very pleased with them. I think they're all made in Russia and just distributed with different trade names over different parts of the world. I kind of like that kind of pocked background there that I got with the spattering. You can do more spattering if you want, but I think that's probably pretty good for this. And I am going to just gently kind of wipe away some of the paint in this flower before I dry it, because I got some hard edges there. I'm just going to blot that with my paper towel. And if you feel like your bottles are a little dark, you can blot them or blot areas of them. You can actually, if you're using like an Arches paper, you can wipe a little bit. But remember, we have our pastels for our highlights, so you don't need to go crazy about it. If you're using a cellulose paper, then just blot and don't wipe. But if you are using a cotton, you can wipe. It's just, if you go back and forth between those types of papers, I wouldn't get in the habit of wiping too much, because you will pill a cellulose paper if you wipe it. I like that because you can pull out some highlight right off the bat.
Pascalito, what is your favorite warm red from the M. Graham line? Trying to decide between Naphthol red, Pyrrole red, Scarlet Pyrrole, etc.
I really like their Naphthol red. It's really pure, but I've heard somebody, maybe it was Rich, that told me that it's not as light fast as other ones, and that's why I don't see it very much in watercolor. So maybe I'd go with Pyrrole, just because that's a little bit more of a stable pigment. And Naphthol is a little more transparent, which in a warm red is kind of harder to find, because your warmer colors tend to be more opaque. But really, with M. Graham, I don't think they make a bad color. Just look for a single pigment. The Naphthol is quite neutral. I wouldn't even really call it that warm, because it is a very neutral. And in addition to the watercolor brushes we're using today, I also grabbed an old Stiff Hog oil painting brush, and this is going to be really good for doing the texture on the tabletop here where our bottles are sitting. So you don't have to have a fan, but just some scruffy old stiff brush will work really good for this. You want something where your bristles will kind of pull apart a little bit, so that's why a beat up brush is wonderful for this sort of effect. So never throw away your nasty old brushes because they're really good for doing texture. We got 1 thumbs down before we even started, so we got a psychic.
We have 2 right now. I'm
wow,
not sure.
Wow, there are so
I
many
noticed that there was
psychics
1
out
thumbs
there.
down. I'm like, how is there a thumbs down? We haven't even started. Merry Christmas and a happy holiday to you, sir, ma'am. It's not our fault you got coal in your stocking.
Oh. There we go. That feels pretty well dry. Okay, so we're going to go right ahead and get some of the texture on this tabletop, because that way you don't have to worry about trying to paint around some bottles that are beautifully done. We're going to start by mixing. What's that?
It was just the way that beautifully done. Well, they are. It was the way you said it. Sorry.
well, they will be beautifully done when we're done. Sarah loves painting glass, and she's very upset that she has to work and she's not participating in today's project.
Yes, I am.
Actually, no, to make this a little bit easier, I think I'm going to grab some tape, and I'm going to just lay it right across here so our texture is only going to land on the tabletop. And then we can see how straight we drew our table. We tape down. Well, if your table's off, you'll be able to fix it right now, because we'll just stick that right there.
Or maybe it's just an old crooked table.
That's true. It's farmhouse. It's it's stylish now.
You could actually charge $200 more because it's crooked.
That's true. It's rustic. It's artisanal. We have an artisanal table.
Oh, speaking of which, I gotta go look. I gotta find a new coffee table.
You do?
Well, the one we have is too big for the living room.
Oh. I was just saying, I have a coffee table I'm not using downstairs, but it's probably too, but it's probably as big as the one you had. It was a big coffee table.
Exotic Drawn. How do you deal with paper buckling when doing wet on wet? As a beginner, my paper is cheap, so it buckles a lot.
One thing you can do, I have a video on it on my channel. You can stretch the paper, and what that does is it pulls your paper really tight. You basically wet it, and then you lay it down onto a sheet of masonite, which is like a hardboard you can get at the hardware store, and then you tape it down with gummed tape, and that's kind of like the tape that you would use to tape up a package. It is dry, and then when you wet the adhesive, it sticks down, and so it sticks to your wet paper, and then you end up with, as it dries, it pulls the paper fibers really tight, and then you get this like tight as a drum paper. You can tap on it. It sounds like a drum. It's that. It's pulled that tightly, and that will make your paper much better to paint on, and it will make it act much more like a better quality paper. So I'd probably recommend doing that, and see if your paper can handle the stretching. Usually it can. I mean, I've used some really cheap papers, like from the grocery store even, and done that method, and it really made them perform a lot better. Now the colors that we're using for our shadows here, we're mixing with burnt umber, or with the umber color and the and ultramarine blue. And those are very liftable colors, so I'm not worried if I get any in the bottles because I can scrub those away a little bit. And plus we're going to use pastels, so really just have fun with this. Don't worry about it too much. And by using this fan brush, you're going to end up with much more organic lines because you just can't, it's a cruddy old brush, you're not going to be able to control it even if you wanted to very well, so you're going to get that nice texture. And you even add some color in there if you wanted to do a little bit of, I think I'll take some yellow ochre and take some ultramarine blue so I get kind of like a grayed sage color. Drag some of that in there as well. And that texture of the paper is really going to catch on the bristles and give you some nice texture too. So you can have that kind of worn paint look. Grab some a mix that I had in my palette from before. It's phthalo green and phthalo blue, which we'll be using in our bottles. So I can get this kind of paint color down with that too. Any color you're planning on using in your painting, it's great to somehow integrate into your background because it will make it look much more realistic, much more harmonious. some phthalo blue on its own. I'm going to drag this down here. You want enough water so that your paint will move, but not so much that it won't come off your brush. Not so much that it won't puddle. You just kind of want to get that dry brush texture. Get some smudgy patches in there. And you're not going to hurt this brush. This is a beat up old oil painting brush. And some more umber and yellow ochre. Very distressed look here. The messier you make it, the better it's going to end up looking when we're done. How many people do we have hanging out today?
We have 313.
Awesome.
316.
Wow.
Shona Brockway, if you don't have a fan brush, what's another option?
Any like old scruffy brush. Like probably not something you'd typically use with watercolor. Even like those are if you have like those cheapo plastic bristled glue brushes that are disposable. If you have a woodworker in your house, you probably have like a bag of those around somewhere. You want something with stiff, unwieldy bristles, basically, or even a kid's paintbrush that's got those plastic, coarse bristles would work really well. You just want something that's going to give you a really rough texture. And then I am going to go in with a fairly stiffer brush, and I'm going to scrub out some of the color in the bottles. I'm just going to use my Maxine's mop. I generally use that for smaller areas, but it'll work just fine, and I have it right here. So what you do is just take clean water, and you just brush over the area you want to lighten up. And then you blot it with a dry paper towel. And don't worry about getting everything out. This is just to give us a little bit of lightness in there. We don't want to have too much dark behind our bottles.
Molly McLaughlin, can you recommend a cheat sheet for warm versus cool colors? I haven't developed an eye for it yet and suspect I'm mixing warms and cools.
I would say make a color wheel, because you're looking, if you want to get a cool color, like a cool red, you would pick the red that's closer to violet. So if you put your colors down on a color wheel and you label them, I think that would probably be the best way. And then you'll instinctively begin to see what colors are warm and cool. It's tough to do a cheat sheet because some brands, like, there can be cooler and warmer versions of the same color depending on like who made them, how finely they milled them. It's really something that you'll get just through practice and experience. But I would say put your colors out in a color wheel and label it so you know what you have. I can't think of one specific like cheat sheet. And use a limited palette. 'Cause if you've got 45 colors you're trying to keep straight, that's gonna hinder your progress. There we go. I made that bottle a little bit long, but that's all right. I kind of like that one's kind of stepping out of line. That one's a little bit lower on the table, but that's all right. All right,
Vintage, darling, vintage.
Vintage. Yes. So what I'm going to do now is dry this because I want to go in and add a glaze on the bottles, but if any of this is damp, it's going to feather, and I need a crisp, hard line for the bottles, or they won't look realistic. So we just want to dry our tabletop. So if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them.
Pescalito, what do you think of using colors like sepia, Payne's gray, neutral tint for mixing darks?
Some people do that. I really don't. I prefer to use the colors that I'm already using to make my darks. But everybody has their own style and their own way of doing things. I think if you're using Payne's Gray anyway, like maybe you're painting a stormy landscape, Payne's Gray is beautiful in the sky of a stormy landscape, and if you want to use that to, add to colors to make your darks, that's fine. I wouldn't introduce it to a painting unless the colors were going to be there anyway. I wouldn't be like, okay, I need a dark, so I'm going to grab Payne's Gray and add it to my blue bottle color. I wouldn't do that. I would make sure to integrate it at the beginning of the painting if it was really important for you to use that color. There's no bad color. It's just if you're going to use it, I wouldn't use it just because, well, that looks like it's easier than mixing my own color. I would use it and integrate it throughout your whole painting so there's harmony. Otherwise, it might look a little out of place and discordant or amateurish if it's added kind of just because you don't want to mix the color. Because it often does not replicate the other colors. It doesn't act like it's part of the scene. It looks like you've turned a different color light on one subject and everything else is lit a different way.
It's like a peacock in amongst the pigeons.
Yeah.
Or pigeons in amongst the peacocks. I don't know. I'm tired. Brain.
It's a tiring day. I think to keep warm in the sub-zero tundra we live in, it saps the brain cells.
I just didn't sleep good last night, so that'll do it.
Yeah, that will do it. Alright, so I'm wetting my bottle. And this one I'm going to do in shades of green. I'm going to start off with phthalo green, which is a great color to mix with. On its own, it's very strong, but if you mix it with colors, it looks really good. So I'm going to add a little bit of yellow ochre to that to warm it up a little bit.
We had a question on how wet the brush should be when you were removing the background paint from the bottles, the table color. How wet should that brush be?
I get the brush pretty wet on those. They're not gonna, it doesn't hold quite as much water as like your typical watercolor brush because it's a little bit stiffer and not as porous. So I wet it pretty well. And then and of course that wetness goes onto the paper because if you don't have any water there, you're not gonna lift up any of the paint. So it's got to be fairly wet. I just dip it and bring it over. But it doesn't have a ton of bristles, so it's not going to hold, like, gobs and gobs of water.
Queen City Arts, what is a good weight watercolor paper if you don't own any?
140 pound is a great place to start. Some people love 300 pound, but I wouldn't recommend starting on that because it's very expensive and it could be a little too precious to use if you drop over $10 $10 on a sheet. So I would do 140. Some people would do 90, but I find that buckles so much, unless you're willing to stretch it, it could make you very frustrated.
Amber Pomeranian, I have seen sponges and watercolor palettes. What are they used for?
Well, you can use them for applying paint. If they're a coarse, like a cellulose sponge or a sea sponge, you can use them for wiping your brush on. Usually if it's like there's a little slot in your palette and there's a sponge there, like the koi palette, that's more for wiping your brush off and cleaning your brush. And it's usually not a very textured sponge if that's its purpose. And you can use it for like lifting out color from your painting. It just depends on the type of sponge it is. It's either for adding texture, applying paint, or cleaning your brush. I'm just adding a little bit of the color more intensely to the edges where the bottle will be thicker. This bottle must be really vintage because it's not very symmetrical.
It was hand blown.
Apparently, I gotta make this a little bigger. That's what you
Romel Madre. Can Lindsay recommend a good set or brand of brushes for India inks? Because he's thinking about getting the Dr. Phil Bombay India ink.
I would go with a like a golden Taklon set because they're also going to be a little bit less likely to stain than a white bristle. But they're essentially very similar. I mean, if you don't mind them getting stained, you could get a white bristle. But Majestic, or actually the Majestic ones have black bristles, so if they stained, you'd never notice it. And they're pretty robust by Royal and Langnickel. Either the Majestic or the Aqualon. You might want to buy something that looks different than other stuff you have so you don't get it confused with your other brushes. It won't hurt to use any brushes you have for acrylics with India ink. So if you already have acrylic brushes, just go ahead and use those. I wouldn't use your fine watercolor brushes with them because of the shellac in the ink. It could dry in the ferrule and damage them. But if it's a brush that's meant to hold up to acrylic paint, it's going to do fine with the India ink. But if you don't have anything yet, I would definitely check out Royal and Langnickel Majestic. You do not want natural hairbrushes for that. They'll snap them if they dry.
Girl.
Alright, we're wetting this bottle, and we're going to add in some yellow ochre towards the middle. And used with a lot of water, it will be transparent. Yellow ochre does have a reputation of being one of our more opaque watercolors. You could always use raw sienna if you want a more transparent color that's similar to yellow ochre. And I'm going to grab some of that mix that we did, the phthalo and yellow ochre, phthalo green and yellow ochre, and pull that in around the edges. And that bottle's going to have a little fluted texture to it, so we're going to have some more details on this. This one's a little bit thinner of glass that doesn't have any texture on it really, so it's going to be lighter because you don't have so many thicknesses of colored glass for light to pass through. And I'm going to grab a little bit more green on its own and just kind of add a little bit more thickness to the edge and the bottom. Less is more usually with bottles, just kind of give it a slice of color here and there and let it do its thing. And the next one is going to be more of a blue bottle. We're just going to again wet it. Don't worry about highlights because we're going to be using pastels. Don't need to reserve anything. Does it look bright enough to you, Sarah? Should I bring my lights on the painting more, do you think? Or is
I think it's good. I think if you go much brighter, you're going to get super reflective. Because it's super, from where I am, the palette where you don't have paint,
yeah,
the white's pretty glary at the moment. Okay. So I think if you were to add more lights, it would.
Okay. Don't worry if when you're wetting the bottle, you reactivate some of the paint underneath, that's fine. It's all gonna, bottles are transparent, totally fine to see some of that color in back there. I'm gonna use the phthalo blue and a little bit of ultramarine. And it's gonna give us kind of more like a cobalt or cerulean tone when we have it really thinned down as it mixes with the water there. I think one of the mistakes you can make with this is going too heavy with your paint right off the bat, and then you lose the transparency of the bottles. It's very easy to do because it's fun to paint with those jewel tone colors. Do you have any tips to add about painting bottles, Sarah?
It's fun, and it won't make you pull all your hair out.
That's more of a testimonial, but than a tip. But okay, I'll take it.
I don't, because my one and only attempt at painting glass was very frustrating and did not come out great.
I think it came out beautifully.
It didn't. If you could all see me, I'm just shaking my head quietly and going, no. I think that one got recycled.
Kind of concerned how quiet it is in this house with the amount of children and animals that are here.
Well, I'm assuming the girls are with Eleanor in one of the rooms.
Probably. She'll have a makeover, probably.
That's okay. They babysit. They're professionals.
That's true.
I trust them.
All right, so remember anything that you paint on the bottles when they are wet is going to blend. Okay, so don't try to get like the really hard, crisp lines at the stage. Anything you do here is going to be very, very soft focused here. And the last one, we will do another green one. I mean, I guess you could do whatever colors you wanted. You could do violet. Those are pretty when you see those really light, pale purple bottles. And again, I'm going to start with yellow ochre, nice and watery. And plus, that's nice for when you do catch a little bit of the yellow on its own, you get that pretty glow of just the light passing through. And I'll grab some of this phthalo green with yellow ochre mixed into it to add to some of the edges and let the paint just kind of flow. I didn't do a lot of sketching on the flowers except for this big one here and that one there. The other ones are very loose and airy, so I just kind of put an indication of where they were since we'll be doing those with pastels. And just a little bit darker on the bottom. Maybe add a little bit of blue. Right down here, you have that bump on the bottom of the bottle. Okay, now we can work on some of the flowers while the vases are drying. Well, the layer one of the vases are drying anyway. And I think that's dry enough. We'll start off just with a really light wash on the rose over here because it's a really light colored flower. I'm going to start just wetting it with clear water.
Chewy, I think you've gotten all the crumbs, all the drips, all the dribbles. There's no cat food left.
She's finding some drinks.
Oh, she's finding scent molecules on scent molecules.
So I wet the flower, excuse me, I wet the flower here and I'm just going in with a little bit of that pinkish red on my brush. It is PR 170. I believe that's the Yarka Rose color, but you can use any sort of cool red. And now I'm just going to spread out some of that color so it's a little bit, so everything has a little bit of color on it. And then I've got this mix here. It's the ultramarine blue and a little bit of that rose red again. And I'm just going to go in and add it kind of underneath where petals have turned over, where petals overlap, just to kind of put a very quick and easy shadow in there.
Jennifer Alvarez, will it hurt my watercolor brushes if I use them with Neocolor 2 and then use them with watercolor? Excuse me, I own Aqualons, Majestics, and Mimics.
Use the Aqualons or Majestics with the Neocolor 2s and they'll be fine. I think that the Mimic, did you say Mimics as well?
Yes,
I think
Majestic, Mimics, and Aqualons.
Yeah, use the Majestic or Aqualons with the Neocolor 2s and you can go right back into your watercolor without hurting anything. The Mimics are a little soft for that, and I think if you might hurt the brushes because you have to be a little more vigorous to get the pigment because it is a harder, more viscous pigment on the watercolor crayons. Now I'm going to move over to this guy and let that dry a little bit. Oh, actually, I think I'm going to put a little bit of yellow ochre in some of the highlights while I have it still wet, and then I'm going to move over to the next guy. Not too much because you could get mud where if it mingles with the purple, but a little bit will warm it up and give it a nice look. And I'm using a number 8 round the whole time, but if you feel like going to a smaller brush, feel free.
Lisa Decker, was the preliminary sketch done in regular graphite pencil? I couldn't remember the name of the pencil that you had gotten.
Yeah,
I know you used
it was just a mechanical pencil. It was a pretty smudgy one, so you might want to go with something a little less smudgy, like maybe like a 2H, or just one of your pencils that's a little bit lighter and less smudgy. I have to go a little bit darker so that I can scan the pattern and it will transfer. And this one did smudge a little bit. I had never used those pencils before. I just picked them up because I thought they were really pretty there, and I like a smudgy lid. So I'm going to putting this base stem in here, and I'm giving it a very staccato line. I'm just kind of dabbing and dragging, and I'm going to pull that right into the vase. Even though the vase is a little wet, I want to bring that right into the vase. And then on the tip of the brush, I'm going to move my paper so you can see how my brush is kind of hitting the paper a little bit, hopefully. I'm just going to drag off these little curved kind of little leaves. I guess they're really tiny, just little, you can see that, hopefully without my hand in the way. You want your brush at like a 90-degree angle, that's why I'm trying to tip my paper so you can kind of see. And go ahead and switch to a smaller brush if it's easier. But you just want to pull off these little curved, almost, they look like little curved grasses, kind of. And maybe I'll grab a smaller brush and go in with, I'll grab my liner because I can go a lot longer with that. And I want a little more yellow ochre in that color, so I'm going to do the yellow ochre and the phthalo green. And that'll give us a nice earthy, almost like a sap green actually.
Chewy. If she was any closer to the cat box,
gosh,
her head would be
in the cat box.
Which is probably where she'd prefer to have it.
Ew.
So gross. Oh, we were never able to break you of that, were we, Chewy? Oh.
Okay, so we're not going to do the white flowers with the watercolor, but we can go ahead and put some centers in. And also they'll give us a nice place for, to know where we kind of want our flowers. I'm just going to put like a sloppy yellow ochre dab wherever I think I want a flower. And that will help the white even stand out more. And that's just going to dry, and we're going to move on to the next flower, which is this big one over here. And I'm actually going to start in the center. It's got a really dark center, so I don't think I'm going to wet that paper yet. I'm going to mix up some, let's start with some ultramarine and some phthalo blue and some red.
Patty Picasso, how was Christmas in the house of Weirich? Any arty presents?
Yes. Well, my husband got me a little air compressor for my airbrush because I'd always just kind of dragged out the big, rugged air compressor. And so that was really great. So it's a small one, almost kind of like what you would do for like cakes or makeup. And a set of 12 Posca pens, which are an acrylic paint pen. I actually have them. they're right here. These are really cool. I've played with them a little bit already. And the Fashionpedia book, which is a book that I really wanted. It's all about garments and bags and shoes and basic garment construction and basic, what do you call this shirt? What do you call that shirt? It's got pretty much any type of shirt or sleeve or coat or skirt that you can think of. It's really cool. And that again is called Fashionpedia. So those were my artsy presents, and I'm looking forward to playing with them some more. Did you get any artsy presents, Sarah?
I didn't, but I did get a new lap board, which helps me do artsy things in the living room sometimes.
Oh, nice.
So I needed, because the lap board I had was one Graham gave me.
Oh, wow.
I think she gave it to me right after John and I met.
Wow.
Like the cover on it was peeling, it was all stained, the stuffing was all, so John got me a really nice cozy one, and it's bamboo covered, because sometimes if I'm watching a movie or something, I'll do I'll make some earrings or
Yep.
color or sketch or stamp or something. And this is it's a bigger lap board, so I have more room.
Nice. So is it like a lap desk kind of? Or?
Kind of, but it doesn't have like a cup holder or anything. It's just a nice flat surface.
Nice.
Queen City Arts, is it best to get watercolor paper on a block or loose?
Oh, it's personal preference. It doesn't matter. The blocks are very convenient. You pay for that convenience. But you can actually make your own too. I have a tutorial on how to make your own block. So you can buy paper and then you can chop it to size and turn it into a block. So you have that convenience without the price tag. It just takes you a little time, but not even that much. I'm using a mix for these leaves. I've wet a few of the leaves, and I'm using phthalo green, yellow ochre, and phthalo blue. And I've got this kind of like dusty teal color. And I'm just going to fill in a few of these with that color. And I also blotted out a little highlight on the center of that. I think the most economical way to buy your paper usually is in full sheets, in multiples. So, I just kind of keep my eyes open because I know there are certain brands of paper I really like. And if I see the price go really low, either on Amazon or Jerry's Artorama, then I'll order a pack of 10, and then I'll just tear it down to size. But you need to make sure it's something that you're going to use in something you can store. Because if you don't have room to store it and it gets wrinkled and damaged, then saving that money doesn't do you any good if you can't use it. Use the product. I'm gonna do one of these dry just to see how different it is. So if you want to paint these on dry instead of pre-wetting them, because there are some kind of small spaces there, just make sure you water the paint down more on your palette. Otherwise, you're going to end up with it too dark. So you can do it either way, whichever you prefer. And just be careful with that center. It's probably still a little bit wet, so you want to just leave a little bit of a gap. Now the leaves right around here, the shorter ones, do appear to be a little more green. So I'm mixing into a puddle of color that's got less blue in it. It's almost like the longer the petals get, the more blue they get in them. And because I'm using I think this is the number 2 round, the bristles are kind of small, they're kind of, they're short and they're not as long, so I do have to reload my brush more often, but I do get better control because I'm using a shorter bristled brush. These paints have a lot of pigment in them, so you can water them down quite a bit and get a really transparent color. And that's probably where a lot of the struggle you might run into with these paints are. Just they re-wet really easily, and it's easy to get a lot of color when you're not used to it, especially if they're maybe your first artist quality paints, since they are a lot more affordable than a lot of their other competitors. But as long as you're, as long as you kind of know that they're strong and you mix them out on your palette, I think you're going to be fine. I'd much rather have a color that's too bright than too dull. And when you're painting a stem going into a vase, if you see that there's like a bump, like in the glass, you want to make sure you have that bump showing in wherever your stem goes, because that glass is going to refract the whatever you have inside the jar too, so you're going to get that kind of bent image, and that's what makes it look kind of realistic when you do that. And I'm going to add a little bit more yellow to the stem so it's a little bit more realistic. So I took some of the yellow ochre and mixed it in some of the green on my palette and just putting that in there. Okay, and so for this one, it's got a lot of little white flowers on it. So what I'm going to do is just get like the stems in here with some light green, and then we'll put the white flowers on with our pastel. And I'm going to go with a liner for that because I need to have something that can carry a bunch of pigment. And for colors, it's that same mix of yellow ochre and phthalo green. Phthalo green's a really good color. For one, it's really strong, so you don't go through much of it. But the other thing is it's such a clean, transparent, crisp, vivid color that you can mix it with a lot of different colors and still get a beautiful green. This is really pretty mixed with like cadmium orange. You get a beautiful, really earthy green that way, but still vibrant. You can mix it with any of your yellows and oranges for beautiful greens. You can mix it with your deep reds and purples for really interesting darks. It's a really great mixing color. On its own, it can be a little garish, but mix it with stuff and it's just gorgeous. So this is almost going to look like kind of palm trees here, where you're putting in these little...
palm trees,
I know.
warmth.
Remember warm weather?
Well, you know it's bad when it says 9 degrees outside. You're like, oh, it's so nice out
I
today.
know. You'll go for a walk.
Oh,
Bring out the copper tone.
yeah.
They're in the double digits. It's 11. I remember 11 degrees. That was so
It's
nice.
so good. Do you remember when it was 25?
Oh, man.
Oh, it almost makes me want to pull the shorts out.
Yeah.
Bev Roberts, where is your light source coming from in this painting?
This one, we haven't done our highlights on, but it's kind of in front and from the left front area. I'll show you the photo here. So your high highlights, there's a fairly soft overall light, 'cause you don't have any strong shadows on the ground, but your highlights, your catch highlights here are coming from the front left. You can kind of see where they're getting the brightest ones. But I mean, you are getting highlights in other areas because this was lit obviously with probably a 2-point or 3-point lighting source. So you don't have any really harsh shadows anywhere. But that's where our high highlights with the pastels will be coming from. Okay, now I do want to do some sort of shadowing on the table itself though, because I don't feel like there's enough weight underneath our bottles, so we are going to mix up some dark for that. I'm going to take some ultramarine and some umber, and you can use, if you already have it dried on your palette, go ahead and just reactivate it. And I'm going to start by just kind of putting some of that color right underneath each of the vases, just to give it a little bit of a foundation area, give it a place to stick to the table. And then I'm just going to kind of wisp it out. I just blotted my brush. I'm just going to kind of wisp it out so it just goes over all the texture and everything that we have there. It isn't too distinct. And I feel like I need more, so I'm going to mix up a darker concentration of the umber and ultramarine blue. Not a lot of water though. And this will also be a good color inside the vases for where we need like streaks of really dark. So I'm going to go again right underneath. If you do this in little steps like this, you're never going to get into a situation where you have way too much shadow. So this is going over the area that I just blended out, so it's still a little wet, so I shouldn't have any really hard, uncontrollable lines. The only hard line should be where the shadow touches the bottle. And then while I've got that color on this brush, I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to put some of the shadows on the bottles. So this is a fluted bottle, so you've got these bumps on the face of the bottle. So I'm just putting in a few marks to show that it's fluted. And this is actually somewhat of a squared off bottle, so I'm going to use this dark color to kind of make that a little more pointed. And also add a little bit of definition there in that center crease of the bottle. And so you can kind of sculpt out a little bit here. And on this one, we're gonna have like a pretty dark edge here. Really small marks when you're getting in with a really strong color like this. I did a little bumpy line there because that's those two little ridges there where the lip of the bottle is. And you can correct areas too. If you see something that's not quite straight or is tipping the wrong way, you can definitely correct with this darker color. And then here you're going to have that kind of punt of the bottle there. We have the dip on the coming up from the bottom. Like wine bottles have that kind of, like at on the bottom of a wine bottle, you can usually kind of feel that indent. And we're using the same color for each of these. That's that same shadow color. And see, there's no guessing when you mix your own shadows. You don't have to guess, well, what is that dark? You've already used it, you've already made it, you're making it from what's already there. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out. Because I've got this set, I'm only using 6 colors, even though this is a 24 color set, and I will, you know, use all those colors from time to time, but not all in the same painting. Bump on that one too. And don't worry about being perfect because these are objects made of glass. They are made by people. They're not perfect. And when your brush gets so dry that your bristles want to spread apart, you probably do need to add a little more paint to it or just dampen it a little bit because you do need to have that. When you're doing the glass, you don't want that dry brush texture. You want it to be more crisp. So you can go ahead and wet your brush, mix up a little bit more so you can keep it as dark as you want and carry on.
Up at the sound of something hitting the floor.
House is full of droppy kids that drop treats.
Because the rule at the house is usually if I'm making something or cooking something and it hits the floor, she can have some.
Yeah.
So when she hears something hit the floor, she's all over it.
Okay, so we put in our darkest shadows for the most part, and then your glass really starts to come to life, I think, once you get those dark shadows in there. So now we can actually get some more of the colored shadow glazes in there. More refractions than shadows, or you're seeing overlapping parts of glass. So for here, we're going to go with our phthalo green, just really watery, kind of on its own. And the nice thing about this is that, you know, even if you don't mix it exactly the way, like we added a little bit of the yellow ochre on this, it doesn't really matter because you're going to see everything else that you put on the bottle previously because we have a transparent glaze. So, you know, you can just use one color. Make sure you don't get any beads on the ferrule, beads of water. They can slide down and mess up your picture. And vary your line width, so you can have some like wider streaks of color and some narrow streaks of color, and that just gives it much more of a realistic look. If your bottle has printing on it, you can even kind of, I wouldn't spell anything out too much because then your mind will try to read it, just kind of get that like texture of maybe some impressed words. Some of that over here too. For this this bottle here, I actually want to just use the phthalo blue on its own. Maybe grab a little bit of that phthalo green, but not the ultramarine this time, because I want to get those cooler, greener blues.
Need to go out too? Gotta pee.
And I'm going to be using pastel on this, but if you prefer and you want to use colored pencil, you certainly can do that. And just using a little bit of the green, a little bit of yellow ochre in it, because this is a little bit warmer of a bottle here. And then under the bottles, you can actually put any of these colors that are in the bottles. You can just kind of drag a little out from there, because that generally your light will shine through the bottle and cast some of that color onto the table. Rinse my brush and get some of the blue. And now I want to add a little bit of definition on some of the planks on the table, so I do need to mix up a little bit more color for that. And I'm using the sepia, or I'm sorry, the umber, and a little bit of the ultramarine blue to make myself a nice dark brown. And I'm just going to go ahead and put in my planks again. My brush is at a 90-degree angle with the paper, so that I will have that control. And I'll put one back here too. And I'm just kind of going through and adding some chunks of shadow, chunks of darker color. Can drag some of those colors right through the bottles too. Very lightly though, because it would be distorted a little bit with the glass from the bottles. And I feel like the leaves up here could use a little bit more definition, so I'm going to go back to the number 2 round, and I'm going to mix up a nice kind of shadow color. I think I'll actually just take some phthalo green and take some of that purpley mix. I think that'll be a nice shadow, so it's almost like got a teal, so it's like that red and blue, red and ultramarine to make our purple, then adding a little phthalo green to that. It's just giving us a nice teal, and I'm just going to go in and put a few shadows in some of those leaves. Make sure you have plenty of water so the paint can come off of this tiny brush. And I'm just kind of adding a shadow on like one side of the leaves.
Rommel Madre, have you found that the Derwent watercolor pencils are light fast, and how do you store watercolors for sale?
Watercolor for sale I put inside of acid-free bags, clear bags, and store them in a portfolio, which is like a big folder basically. And the Derwent watercolor pencils, I don't know if they're light fast or not, but I have had some paintings that I've done a long time ago with them that have lasted fine. But I can't vouch for sure on light fastness. I would contact Derwent. As far as light fast pencils, the Albright drawers are supposed to be really good, and anything by Karen Dosh is supposed to be really good. So when in doubt, ask the manufacturer. Generally you wouldn't hang watercolor. Generally with watercolor, work on paper, whether it's watercolor pencil or watercolor paints, you would have it behind glass, which helps tremendously. Plexiglass helps even more as far as keeping fading at a minimum. And you're generally not hang, like I don't hang things in direct sunlight either because it's not recommended, but I've had good luck with them. My sister has a couple pieces I did Derwent watercolor pencils hanging in her home, and I haven't noticed them to fade, but then again, they're not in direct sunlight because they're watercolors. So
I'm still here.
She's letting me play games.
Oh, Maisie is?
Yeah.
Oh, aren't you lucky? That's That's why it was so quiet.
Just checking.
Just checking.
You didn't leave me here with these crazy people, did you?
Oh no, she's like her dad. She's like Andrew in the Glad You side of the family. She can be pretty social when she wants to be.
I'm just using some phthalo blue and just adding some little, kind of like little, I don't know, little thorns down here in the center. And I think that's all I want to do with the paint. So I am going to dry this, and then we're going to proceed with the pastel. I actually am going to bring in a little bit more color back there. That doesn't really, seems like our tabletop is disappearing. There we go. So if you have any questions while we're drying before we begin the pastel, then now's a good time to ask them. I feel like I'm mumbling. I hope people can hear me all right.
Oh, they'd let us know if they couldn't. Christina Martin, when you were just beginning, how did you keep track of which are more transparent and which are more opaque?
I started watercolor painting when I was 7, so I don't remember that well, but I started with a limited palette, I guess, would be the thing. So I knew those colors so well before I ever got any new colors. So I think that's what I would recommend, is just stick to a limited palette and get to know those colors. If one rule of thumb here, and I'll show you on my palette, if you look at your paints, if you can tell what color they are dried in your palette, then they're going to be more opaque. If you can't tell what they are because they look completely dark, or they look very different when you paint them out, then they're transparent. Transparent colors just show up as super, super dark in your palette. Opaque colors will show more of their true color in your palette. That's why it's a good idea to swatch out your watercolors, because they look deceiving when they're dried down in your palette. Because you need the white of the paper to make the watercolor really look like the color they are, because they're so transparent. But if you're shopping, it should tell you right on what you're buying whether you have transparent, whether it's a transparent color or an opaque color. I'm gonna grab my pastels here. I'm using Schmincke pastels because those are my favorite. They're super soft. They're great for going over watercolors because they're just they're so opaque. They really stand up, and I just like them the most because they're not scratchy at all. They're buttery soft. But you can use whatever you want for this. Pastel pencils. You can use color pencils for that matter if that's what you have and that's what you want to use. I'm going to start off with white, and I know this one's broken, so I'm just going to dump that out of the little sleeve. And I'm going to do the little daisies up here. All I'm doing is just little dashes around the centers that I made. So this is going to be not very detailed. If you prefer a more detailed look, use your pencils, colored pencils or pastel pencils. I just want to get those bursts of white color. Usually when you see wildflowers, you're seeing more of like the overall impression of everything rather than the details, because they're usually little small blossoms. So I'm kind of just letting the beauty of the watercolor underneath and the lovely color of the pastel show through. I'm almost just doing like a scribbly ring for my flower versus like all those individual little petals. Now while I have the white, I can go ahead and add some highlights on things. I generally, because pastels can be expensive and they're usually in sticks like this, I generally will just turn my stick around until I find an edge that I can use, because I wouldn't want to sharpen them and lose all of that pastel, because these ain't cheap. And I want to, if I wanted that really bright detail, really sharp detail, I'll grab a colored pencil or something. I wouldn't sharpen this down and waste all that beautiful media. Of course, you can do whatever you want, but that would be my advice. Use the media that's going to give you the effect that you want. Go light with your white highlights here, because you might want to come back in later. We're going to add some midtones as well, and then we'll probably come back at the end and add more white, so you don't want to go too crazy yet with the white. And over here we have a bunch of almost like, I know this looks like a baby's breath, and I'll show you the photo really quick so you can see what I mean. It might actually be a baby's breath. It just looks a little less dry than what we're used to seeing. So we'll just do a bunch of stippling with that. Or you can color really lightly and let the texture of the paper do all the work for you. This is a very fun way to do flowers. Little strokes like this work good because of the texture of the paper. I think I will grab maybe a little bit of green. This is a pretty color. This one, I don't know if that one's, I don't think that's broken. This one's called leaf green. It's funny because this almost looks like chrome oxide green, which is a color that I hate in watercolor. I have to point out it all the time. You know that color I hate? Listen,
you know that one color
that
I
one
can't
color.
stand.
But in pastel, it's kind of lovely.
Isn't that weird how the same color but in a different type of medium?
I think it's probably because with pastels, I want them to be opaque. You know, I want them to cover up and lay down
Right.
really strong. But in watercolor, I want to see what's underneath. I like those veils of almost like, it's like, you know, gauzy fabric. I want to be able to see through it. There we go. Actually, maybe even a little bit of yellow in there would be pretty. I'm going to go with this really pale, kind of lemon color. Oh, that's really bringing it to life. I think it's a nice, lively, crisp, cool color.
Jess C, could you not have blocked out the white flowers in masking fluid as well as the highlights, then finish them at the end as opposed to going the mixed media route?
Totally. You totally can do that. And I'm going to grab some of this. I'm adding this yellow to a few other spots in here. This is, and even when you're doing the mixed media, it is a good idea to try to find a few places you can throw in those colors, so you're not just using it in one spot, you're bringing it around a little bit and kind of cross-pollinating everything. And I think I'll even use a little bit of that on the centers of these flowers. Yeah, you can totally keep that, use the white of your paper and mask it ahead of time. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of masking fluid. It's definitely useful, but when I'm thinking of how do I want to feel while I'm creating this piece, a lot of the time it's not, I don't want to do as much like pre-planning. I want to just kind of jump into it and have fun and let it progress. You know, and you know, instead of, I feel like when you start with masking fluid, you're kind of rewinding a little bit, and sometimes I just want to plow through in one, you know, in one motion. That probably doesn't make any sense, but.
Mary shows, is there a lot of dust with pastels? I've heard they are not good for asthmatics.
Yeah, they're not the best for asthmatics. The way that I'm using it here is very low dust. If you're doing a piece 100% pastel, you're going to have a lot more dust. And definitely, if you're not sure about how to like use pastels or clean up after them, I would recommend getting a cheap kids version because they're not going to be toxic. Whereas some of these may have pigments that, you know, you wouldn't want in the air. And if you're really serious about it, you probably want to invest in some like filtration systems in your studio. But for the amount that I use it, and I'm not asthmatic, and I am careful not to blow the dust into the air, you know, I'm pretty comfortable with not having a filtration system. But yeah, you wouldn't leave these out and let your grandkids play with them or anything because they're definitely, they can be toxic. Because I mean, when you're painting, you've got your cadmiums and all that stuff kind of at least encapsulated in some binder, and then it's not floating through the air. And with pastels, it's you're coming in contact one-on-one with that pigment. There's nothing between you. Look at my hands. I mean, there's nothing between me and that pigment. I'm going to grab some really pale blue. And the other thing with pastels, and I really like pastels, but when you're using a dry media, you do need more colors and need to make a little bit more of an investment than when you're doing painting. Because where you can mix everything with paints, as long as you have some nice, pure, vibrant colors, with pastels, color pencils, you need more colors to do the same amount of stuff. You don't have as much versatility. So, you know, that's something to keep in mind. as one of the factors of whether it's right for you. And you know, I definitely wouldn't start out, if you're not sure, I wouldn't start out with a set like Schminke, just because it's kind of expensive if you're not sure if that's what you wanna do. And you can use different shades of blues and greens on the bottles if you feel like you want to add a little bit more color to them. And this isn't a very big set. This is 30 colors, I believe. 30 or 45, I'm not sure. And I tried to pull the colors into the other bottles because they would kind of reflect on each other a little bit. And it just helps everything kind of coordinate a little bit. Alright. This is kind of a pretty color. It is a little bit more a little more purple, but it's kind of nice to get some of these colors in the mix. It just makes it a little lively. Sargent is a company that makes a very nice kids or student grade or kids grade pastel. They perform really well. They're probably just not as light fast as other brands, but you don't have the toxic chemicals either. So if you've wanted to try it out and not sacrifice the joy and the art, I mean, other than the fact that it might not be light fast, if you just want to play with it and see if you like it, they're going to feel as nice. They're going to perform as well as an artist quality pencil, you know, except for the light fast thing, but the actual working with it is going to be the same. You could try that out and decide if that's something that you would like to get into further. Because if you know right off the bat, if you don't like the feeling of pastel on your hands and it's not for you, you're out $14 as opposed to, you know, upwards of, you know, $80. Okay, I feel like I want some lighter green highlights, so I'm just looking through and seeing what I have. Got a couple lighter green colors. I want something that's not super earthy because the glass wouldn't be that earthy. The flowers kind of would, but the glass wouldn't. So I'm just trying to find something that's a little kind of gauzy, I guess. I don't have too many greens here.
Rommel Madre, do you find using on a slightly wet support provides a more painterly look? I think he means if you use the chalks on wet paper.
I don't use the chalks on wet paper because they would like just grab and be super dark and stain almost immediately, so I wouldn't be able to control it as well. But that might be an effect that works well for you. I like to use it on dry paper, but if they're talking about watercolor, I like to start off on wet paper just because it helps.
No, he was referencing the chalks.
Yeah, I don't use it on wet paper just because it would stain and be really dark, and then I wouldn't be able to.
Would they kind of maybe tear the paper or rough it up too?
They could. These are really soft, so they probably wouldn't. But if you had like a Conte pastel or a new pastel by Prismacolor, those could definitely pill the paper. And now I'm just going to put on a few final
comfortable
lighter highlights
it was
here.
Me this morning. So that was me this morning until I got dressed.
So your brightest highlights are going to be where the light's hitting everything the most. And you can also add shadows if you wanted to. I don't have a great range of shadows here, but I can take some. This is cold gray. It's really dark. It almost looks like a black. I can use some of that, like, just to give the bottoms of these vases a little bit of kind of stability and grounding. So I'm doing it right at the bottom of them. And I can go and get some of the, like, that crack between the boards of the table, just to give it a little bit of dark. And then if I want to go in on the vases themselves and add a little bit, I can. Then mostly in those places where I showed you when we mixed up that dark, and I was saying, you know, kind of put it where the glass is kind of folds over itself, where you have your darkest shadows where you have multiple layers of glass, you can go in and add that there, and that will give you a nice depth. But just be sparing with it because it is a really strong color. It's not quite as black as, you know, a true black would be, but it is the darkest thing we've used, and pastel just lays right on top of that paper, and it's really strong and opaque, so you want to just be sure where you put it and try not to go overboard, but it will give you that rewarding crisp shadow where you want it. All right, maybe just a little more definition on this little flower over here. And then I'm going to call this one done, I think. What do you think, Sarah? Anything
Yes,
else?
I think it's done.
Right, a couple little leaves off this guy here. All right. Any more questions before we finish up today?
We're all caught up.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. My hands are a mess, so you can tell. You always tell how much fun you had by how messy your hands are.
That's right.
I want to thank you guys so much for hanging out and painting. If you have any questions after the live stream, you can go ahead and leave them in the comments below. Please leave a thumbs up before you go so we can cancel out those psychic thumbs downers that left their thumbs down.
I know, 4. There's 4
Oh my
now.
gosh, what's wrong with people? So you cancel those people out, and that's all. Like I mentioned before, the watercolor courses at my Teachable School. There's a coupon code in the video description for 35% off, I think, and that's only good until the end of the year, which is like 2 days away. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, happy crafting.